How are we proceeding?
Yeah. Anna?
Kia ora koutou. I am going to open us up with karakia because we don't have tangata whenua in the room, but acknowledging the land that we're on, going to open up our session with karakia. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia ki te uru tapunui, kia watea, kia mama, kia ngako, kia tinana, te wairua I te ara takata. Ko ia rā e rongo, whakairia ake tirunga, kia tina, tina, kuie taikie. Hereby, our session is open, so I will pass it on to Margaret, who is going to offer some opening remarks.
Thanks again, Anna. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to some people. Good night to some people. A warm welcome to all of you joining us from around the world. From the region, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica and Barbados, internationally from Canada, the US, UK, Australia, and New Zealand. Before we begin, just a few points to note. One, this session is going to be recorded and put on the website. So if you really do not want to be seen, please disable your video. Secondly, please mute all phones when you are speaking. Thirdly, to the presenters especially, please know that you have 5 minutes to present. You will be alerted by a sound when you have 1 minute left. And when your time is up, you will hear a bell, and this is when you stop your presentation. Whilst the presenters are giving their talks, all others can put questions for discussion in the chat. So again, a warm welcome, and the seminar chair is Dr. Camille Nakit. She is Associate Professor at the Auckland University of Technology School of Social Sciences and Public Policy. Camille has done extensive research into Maori and Pacifica educational achievement, factors impacting on migrant resettlement, and culturally relevant research methodologies. Without further ado, I now invite Camille to give you the opening remarks.
Tēnā koutou, kia ora mō kone I tēnei rā, tēnā koe I tātou hoa I United Kingdom, Atamare, ki mātou hoa o Aotearoa, ahi pai ki o mātou hoa o te Karipiana. Hello to you all, good morning to those in Aotearoa, good afternoon to those in Trinidad and those areas up there, and good night to all in the UK. I just want to give you just a brief rundown on our seminar. Thank you all for coming today. We began this journey quite a few years back, and looking at having an affirming methodology for the work that we do on the space that we are in. And so our first conference on Caribbean research methodologies, and I see some of many people from there are still here, so thank you for being on this journey with us, and so many people, all of you have been so very supportive and encouraging, and it has borne great fruit from this. We had our first conference in 2018. We've had a number of onlimes. We sort of colonized the word, recolonized, taking the word online. We've had a lot of onlimes, for those of you in Trinidad who know what liming is. In 2019, liming methodology, so well described by Anna in her thesis. It belongs to all of us, and it's open for all of us to use. And a key thing to note is that we want to move on from a decolonizing methodology to an affirming methodology without being tied to a colonial past and a colonial framework in our thinking, and to value what we do in and of themselves without always having to justify it. against why it's better than a Eurocentric way of doing. So apart from the online that we've had, this is our virtual seminar in lieu of the seminar we were meant to have in Jamaica, which we couldn't have because of the pandemic, and our thoughts to everyone impacted by that pandemic, and hope everybody is okay. We are also co-editing a book, and some of our chapter authors are here. We have written four papers have already been published on Liming and Old Talk. We have a paper in press, one under review with the Oxford Encyclopedia of Education, that's Oxford University Press. An article was requested and asked for by Elsevier, and another chapter for book on peace and conflict studies. People are doing research using Liming and Old Talk, in particular Dylan Kerrigan up in doing on the youth, with the youth in Laventille. And so this is where we are, and we hope with your walking along with us, and us walking along with you, and us walking together, we can claim spaces, not just with Liming and Old Talk, but in the many different ways, our own ways of knowing and sharing knowledge are embraced, and give us a more authentic representation ourselves. So welcome to all the speakers, and to all of you that have woken up, stayed up late, forgone your breakfast to join us here today. We are honored and we are grateful, and have a great session. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Camille. So in the first part of our program this afternoon, this morning, we have two speakers, Dr. Timber Salandi and Dr. Kudakwashe Tuwe. Dr. Timber is going to give the response. He is a sociologist, educator, and activist whose research focus is on Caribbean radical thought, coloniality and decoloniality, and subaltern challenges to hegemonic knowledge, in particular, the inequalities in the production of knowledge. Dr. Salandi is a director at the Institute of Indigenous Knowledge, Empowerment and Research, and his ongoing projects are aimed at encouraging ecological livelihoods, dialogue, and social justice. Our guest speaker is Dr. Kudakwashe Tuwe. He is originally from Zimbabwe and has been living and working in New Zealand for almost 20 years. Dr. Tuwe is currently working for an Iwe Indigenous organization as a human resources advisor. His doctoral thesis utilized the African oral tradition of storytelling to investigate employment-related experiences and challenges of New Zealand-based African communities and the impact of these experiences on their well-being. Dr. Tuwe has published also an article on storytelling titled The African Oral Tradition Paradigm of Storytelling as a Methodological Framework. And this is in the African Studies Association of Australasia and the Pacific Conference proceedings. Let us all welcome Dr. Kudakwashe Tuwe.
Thank you very much for such a welcoming introduction. Right, I am going to be sharing my slides. Can you all see my slides, please?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yes.
Good. Thank you very much. So I've got only 15 minutes, so I will try to focus on the African oral tradition of storytelling. So once again, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I really appreciate. So my first slide there is basically introducing myself there. The introduction has been given. Just hold on. The second slide, this is the outline of my presentation. There are only 14 slides, but I'll major focus on 2 or 3 slides. The first one is what is African oral traditional storytelling. I'll measure on that one because that is the backbone of this presentation. Then the next slide there, it encapsulates and contextualizes my thesis, my study. It's all about African storytelling. The first beautiful woman there, that is my mother, the one who taught me African storytelling, the one who made me what I am today, and she's my heroine. The next picture there depicts how African stories are being told, the structure and how they are set. And that small hut there, it depicts a similar hut where I was born in Zimbabwe, where stories were being told. And my thesis basically was talking about all Africans, people from Africa originally, both refugees and migrants. So the design, this is the design, the research design. There is the thesis topic, which I'm not going to read because of our time. It was a qualitative study, and I'll talk more about the composition, the participants of the study. And that was the main research question, which says, what are the main employment challenges faced by Africans in New Zealand? I'm not going to be talking about the theoretical framework because of our time. I used the labor disadvantage theory, supported by critical race theory. There are many other theories that I could have chosen, but I only chose those particular two for particular reasons. Because of my time, I'm not going to be talking about that one. So let us go to the core business of today. What is African storytelling? African storytelling is a method of recording and expressing feelings, attitudes, and responses of one's lived experiences and the environment. It is important to say that when you talk about African storytelling as a methodology, we are basically expressing how people feel, the attitudes that are embedded in people's lives. And everything is underpinned on their lived experiences and the environment in which they live. So it is inherently powerful because we're talking about how people feel, how they have been treated, and everything else. So that is there's so many definitions, but these are the key definitions of African storytelling. And a lot of you people, you know, Dr. Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o, originally from Kenya. We're so blessed in New Zealand to have him 3-4 times here. And he actually said, African storytelling is retelling a story or a narrative to one or more than one listeners through voice gestures. It is not reading a book or a story or reciting a poem. Far from it. It is something that is shared from the oracles of one's heart based on one's lived experiences. So if you just take a book and start reading, we are not doing any African storytelling. African storytelling is whereby you speak from deep down your heart based on your experiences. And the other definition there, African stories offer explanations of natural phenomena, teach morality. Within the African paradigm, morality is a big issue because this world that we are living in is a lot of teachings. So the African storytelling or African stories, they are underpinned or they're pregnant with issues to do with morality, to teach the young people in particular, so that when they are adults, they really understand their culture, they love their culture, they respect their culture. So African stories are a great and big teacher of morality or moral issues. And also, it provides African people with a sense of identity. People have lost their identity. We have lost our identity. So African storytelling helps people to go back to our origins, to be able to identify who we are. Even right now, we live in the diaspora. It is important that we don't lose the flavor as Africans, as indigenous people. I'm very glad that almost 20 years ago, when we came to New Zealand, my daughter Makanaka, who is actually part of this audience, she was only 10 and our son was only 7. we made a ruling that at the moment we get into our gate or into our doors, we don't speak English because we are not English, we are Africans. So that helped quite a lot. Our children can speak fluent Shona, which is our local language. So we were afraid that as we brought these kids young as they were, they would lose the salt and the flavor of our identity. So African stories help people to keep our identity. And also, they are also entertaining. There are so many jokes, there are so many humors in the African stories. And again, they're also used to instruct. Right. So the next slide that talks about the relevance of African storytelling, which is the next slide there. Why using the African storytelling? African storytelling is a communal participatory experience. It is not about individualism. It is about the collective approach. It is owned. African stories or stories are owned by the community. They are there to be shared by the wider community for the benefit of the wider community. And again, they are to spice the African community or to show the conspicuous of African communities. We use a lot of parables and proverbs, and they have gone to give a definition of proverbs. And also the parable there. A parable is a heavenly story with an earthly meaning with a heavenly story. I think a lot of people who are Christians, they have heard Jesus giving a lot of parables. So there are a lot of proverbs and parables that are used in African storytelling that underpins wisdom. So that at the end of the day, you may say a proverb or you may say a parable, then it is translated to make sure that the meaning is unpacked and the meaning is also revealed. That was from the late Chinua Achebe, an outstanding author from Nigeria. And also in terms of African storytelling, the power of stories and moral lessons. I've already talked about morality, and there is inherent power embedded in African stories. They are pregnant with a lot of power, with a lot of wisdom, and with a lot of morality as well. And the other thing that I also looked at was the functions and roles of the African of storytelling. It is there to mediate and to transmit knowledge and information across generations. Sadly, most of our stories or historical generations are not recorded. They are passed through oral means from one generation to other generation. So at times we tend to lose the flavor, the history, the stories, and everything else. But storytelling has been used for many, many generations in Africa and obviously across the world, especially amongst indigenous people. Utilization, African stories, they utilize traditional knowledge. What is traditional knowledge? I can write a book about traditional knowledge. When I was growing up, my mother told me heaps and heaps of stories. She's one of the most intelligent people I have ever seen in this world, but she doesn't even have a high school education. So there is a lot of knowledge that our traditional knowledge that our people have and undocumented. So through African stories, those things are shared. And we also learn about cosmology. Cosmology, as we know, is the study of the universe. And also we also learn about epistemology, which is how we know what we know. So all those things are embedded within the African storytelling. And also in terms of the African storytelling, the paradigm or using it as a methodology, it is a paradigm entrenched and centered on African philosophy. There are so many philosophies within the African paradigm that can be used. And one of them is Ubuntu. when I was just going through the abstracts, I was so excited. I saw, I think one of the presenters there will be talking about African Ubuntu, and I don't want to steal a lot of information from that person. So I used the African philosophy of Ubuntu as an underpinning philosophy to anchor my thesis. And basically Ubuntu says, I am what I am because of you. It means I cannot do anything, or I cannot do much without you. I need you as an individual. I need my community. I need people around me. So African Ubuntu is also embedded quite a lot within the African storytelling. And the other thing is that I love so much is about decolonization of social research for indigenous thesis. Dr. Camille can really support me. I suffered a lot when I was doing my thesis. One of the examiners was not from the African descent. She was European, and she hated with intensity and with the passion my African storytelling as a methodology. She didn't like it at all. She actually she almost failed. She failed me, and luckily one of the examiners was from the African American, and passed me, so it was almost half and half. So I was asked to do a lot of massive corrections. And I was very angry, to tell the truth. And thanks to Professor Camille who helped me, I was very angry. And I actually made it worse in terms of what I believed in terms of the African paradigm. I made it worse in terms of toning down. I refused. And to cut the long story short, she refused to re-examine my thesis. And Dr. Camille had to look for somebody else who was from an indigenous side. And I got a distinction, and not even a comma, not even a full stop in terms of corrections were required. So what am I saying? I'm basically saying we need a movement to decolonize the social sciences research in terms of methodology. Let us use our own methodologies, indigenous methodologies. Why would I be forced? I'm looking at an African paradigm or topic, and my participants are Africans or indigenous. Why should I be forced to use a foreign methodology to unpack those issues? So yeah, so it's really an issue. Yeah, what am I doing on time, Dr. Anna? How much more time?
You have 1 minute to go, Dr. Tui.
Okay, yeah. So there are a lot of things that the pedagogical skills significance of African storytelling. Then my participants there were basically African community groups. I had 20 individuals, and which was 10 men and 10 women. And if I had more time, I was going to talk about communities, because it was to do with the African communities. There were special groups of communities there. So those were the beneficiaries. The consumers there, people like me and yourself from the indigenous background, who are researchers and in the academic world. And three things that I contributed through African storytelling is basically, my thesis was only the first one in New Zealand that used African storytelling to unpack experiences that were faced by Africans in New Zealand to do with their employment experiences. And like I said, I used the community groups as a concept. It was focused on the use of communities as opposed to individual participants. And like I said there, I used the African Ubuntu, the underpinning African philosophy. And those are the 10 themes that were unpacked in my research, and those are references, and those are my heroes. And my heroine, my mother, is the first one there. She's my greatest hero. And the one on the far left there is our national medium lady who started the Chimurenga War in 1896. So thank you very much, everyone else, for listening, and much appreciated.
Thank you, Dr. Tuve. Over to you, Dr. Salandi. Thank you. We'll wait for Tuve to stop his share.
Okay, yeah.
Greetings all. So I'm speaking to you from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, and I firstly want to congratulate the organizers for this really excellent conference. I also want to congratulate the presenter, Dr. Tuve, for a really excellent presentation. Have any of you ever heard someone relating an experience to you and you actually feel what they're saying vibrate in your very core? Well, that happened to me during your presentation, and it's often a guide for me when somebody is relating something from very deep. I felt all my pores raised. And I want to commend you for standing firm in your conviction in advancing an indigenous and African way of being and an African methodology by which to tell our stories. I think that one of the things that we have to recognize and acknowledge is that Western science and Western research methodologies have been very damaging and abusive to indigenous ways of doing and indigenous research. So how do we reframe and utilize what we may have learned within colonial centers of learning and return it and really draw upon non-Western and non-traditional ways of doing? In other words, how do we make decolonial moves in colonial institutions? And that has really been one of the questions that I've been reflecting on recently, because it isn't as if most of us are in these institutions which are deeply decolonial and really setting a model for how things should be done. So in all of our spaces, there has to be a certain degree of courage and resilience and strength and a certain degree of networking with others of like minds to ensure that we could make the decolonial moves in whatever colonial spaces that we are in. I think that the concept of African storytelling is extremely important. And part of what it does is that it centers non-traditional and non-academic scholars and thinkers. Part of our inheritance of Western academia is that there is often a hierarchy over the non-academic. But the realm of storytelling is really a space in which the academic really has no privilege over the non-academic. It is really a non-academic space in which those who have been the guardians and the gatekeepers of indigenous knowledge, often passed down from generation to generation, can actually have a certain finger on the pulse of the people and connect to the stories that are relevant and meaningful to us. These stories may never be widespread, they may never be popular on mainstream media, but these are the stories that we need to hear. And these are often the stories that the world needs to hear to really emphasize that concept of Ubuntu, which to me speaks to a certain appeal to our inner humanity. When I was a child, I remember many of the stories that was told to me, and there is such a rich legacy of African storytelling, even in the Caribbean. So a lot of the stories within the Caribbean really could be traced back to Africa. So for example, there are stories about Lagahu, or the Sukunya, or Papa Boa, who is really the father of the woods or the guardian of the woods. There is Mama Glow, who is a feminine deity of river animals, who is often a healer. So you have a whole, range of mythology and folklore that really contain very deep lessons that all of us who could otherwise be distracted in a very technologically driven, globalized world could learn from. So I just want to close there by highlighting the urgent need for us to consider such frameworks and really to tap into such ways of being, especially in a context of modern globalization that really hasn't been receptive and inclusive to the wide range of ideas and values that make up the non-Western world. So in closing, I again want to commend the organizers, and you, Dr. Toure, I want to just encourage you to keep on going, and I look forward to talking more with you after this conference. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Salandi and Dr. Toure, for your presentations and your talk. At this point in time, we move right into our presentations, and I want you to note the seminar program that was sent to you. So over to you, Dr. Shakisha Wilson, as you begin our first stream presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Chatur. Welcome all from the warm, sunny island of Jamaica. I joined with my colleagues from the CRM team. I know for some of you it's morning, early morning, but for us here in Jamaica, it's in the afternoon and it's quite hot, despite how our seminar lead is dressed. It's quite the opposite. The first panel discussion for today is titled Affirming Pedagogies in the Caribbean, Our Ways of Being, Knowing, Teaching, and Learning. Now, you would have heard this already coming out in what Camille has said, Dr. Toué has said, and also in the response from Dr. Salande. The notion behind affirming pedagogies or methodologies is that they promote a more culturally relevant way of knowing and doing research that stands on their own strengths. And sometimes those strengths are evidenced in how these methodologies have been used in the past by our ancestors, or even how we do them in our daily ways of existence. Importantly as well, it's the idea of moving away from that comparative point where our local ways are compared continuously to the more traditional and Eurocentric approaches. So in this segment, we have 3 sets of presenters who will be presenting different local and quite distinct Caribbean approaches. First, we have Josh Motka, who will be presenting on Liming Then and Now, a history of liming and its importance to Caribbean society today. Josh will be followed by Veronica Farrell, who will be presenting on contrapuntal reading of selected education research by Caribbean scholars using stories from tales of an Ashanti father. And finally, we'll have Susan Narain and Ryan Persadi, I'm hoping I pronounced that correctly, who will be presenting on Mashup as Method, building community-based approaches to Caribbean research. So without any further ado, I will open the floor now to Josh, who will take us through his presentation. Josh, the floor is yours. Josh?
You know, I'm not seeing Josh.
All right, well, let's move to Veronica Farrell then. Veronica, are you ready to go?
Hi, everyone. Yes, I am. I will be sharing my screen and try to confine myself to the 5 minutes. And so here goes. All right, so hello colleagues, my presentation entails utilizing the contrapuntal approach to reading education research articles produced by Caribbean identified scholars. This approach was instigated by my doing a literature review for a thesis, and I found that when I encountered the Caribbean scholars, I just couldn't read them in the form of ordinary paraphrase. So I went on and I found that I took refuge in this old copy that I have, and the stories were, sorry, I keep touching my screen and it's going ahead of me. So let me just go back a bit. All right, so just to explain, the contrapuntal reading is advanced by Edward Said, and it represents a post-imperial intellectual attitude. It involves reading text normally viewed as incompatible. And so in this case, the folk tale normally seen as incompatible to read a research article is what I am doing. All right, so we went through the screen. So my approach entails rereading by exploring alternatives for researching. In this regard, I'm very conscious of the value of folk tales, and I'm promoting the value of folk tales as Chalisa advanced, as valuable for awareness raising, as well as, sorry again, there I go with the screen. And something that Chalisa said, a simple yet poignant story or well-placed comment could convey a contrary opinion without overtly disrespecting another view. And that is what I am trying to do in this presentation. I'm promoting storytelling as a social practice for analogous thinking, And it's a special gesture I'm using to restore suppressed text and make them equivalent to canonical texts. Okay, so my aims are to counteract the captive mind, and we will see how this applies later on. So I'm going right into reading the story and making this a storytelling event. I noticed Dr. Tuve said that African storytelling is not story reading, so I think I'm violating the code here a bit. But I think this is, I'm especially using this as an event for story. We have to find the time for listening to stories. King Kwadwo, the ruler of a small kingdom, heard tales about how wonderful, sorry, I have to admit, and superior was life in the neighboring kingdom of Kwabena. Kwadwo asked his counselors, what made life in Kwabena superior? They all pleaded ignorance. There I go with my screen again. Kwadwo decided to visit for himself. He was welcomed by Kwabena and spent many days enjoying a warm welcome, all the time observing and trying to find out about how the kingdom was ruled. Try as he might, Kwadwo could see no difference between the laws of Kwabena and his own. At last, during the final banquet, to celebrate his visit, Kwadwo noticed that Kwabena ate with his left hand only and had his right hand covered with a cloth. Kwadwo concluded that must be the only reason for the good rule and happiness in Kwabena's kingdom. He returned home determined to imitate this habit so that he too could enjoy the success that Kwabena did. Kwadwo decreed that from now on, everyone must eat with their left hand. Although this was not considered polite, no one disagreed because they were not used to thinking for themselves. All the advisors, except one old man, agreed that it was a good idea. The old man approached Kwabena, "Your Majesty, did you not inquire why he used his left hand? Did you not ask for a reason?" Everyone gasped at the audacity of this old man. Kwabena said, "Why do I need to ask? Is not the prosperity of the kingdom reason enough?" The old man then went on to tell a tale about how Kwabena lost his hand as a young boy while hunting lions. The counselors now turned to the king. "You have copied blindly the acts of someone else. You are not fit to be king." Kwadwo was removed from the throne, and the old man was asked to be regent until a wiser and more suitable ruler was found. So the significance of my story, let me make sure, sorry for the little technical, okay, so I'm going in the right sequence. So my script might not be the same as what you're seeing. So what I'm contending here is that the inquiry approach taken in this particular study by Brown, Bristol, DeFubab, and Conrad 2014, where they undertook to address the issue of academic underperformance, when read contripally, is equivalent to the whole idea of when the conclusions that they arrived at is telling the people to eat with their left hand. Kwadwo was intent on arriving at a conclusion, having expended so much time and effort in his inquiry. The question remains whether Kwadwo's inquiry about his people's unhappiness should not be directed at the people themselves. Sorry. The central trust, okay, so the central trust of Brown and et al.'s article, inquiry, was the ability and willingness of educators to interpret and use the data of standardized test results. Rereading contrapuntally, like Kwadwo, the researchers wanted to know why the students in one nation were not as successful as imagined others. Brown et al.'s central premise.
Veronica, your time for your presentation is up. You have 10 more seconds to wrap up, and then we'll have to move on to the next one.
So I took too long there. Okay, so I'm just going to run through it and maybe we'll get back to talk about it. So basically what I'm arguing is that the very intricate methodical methods that Brown and et al. Engaged in is equivalent to the Kwadwo inquiry. Brown et al. Concluded that
based on their very exhaustive inquiry, Brown et al. Concluded in the final paragraph of the article
that it comes down to the Trinidad and Tobago government. Sorry, I took off. So my final question is: the Kwadwo type of inquiry appropriate? Okay, appropriate to the reality, the local realities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Veronica. Sorry you didn't have enough time on your side to pull it all together in the end, but we will have the opportunity for questions and discussion at the end. Now, I've been told that Josh is back, so I'll hand over now to Josh. Josh?
Hello? Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we're hearing you, Josh.
So unfortunately, I have to use my cell phone.
Can you turn your camera on, Josh?
I thought it was on. Let me just see here 1 second. How's that?
Yeah, we can see you now.
Okay. So I basically started to look at the idea of liming itself. I didn't know how exactly to describe it as much as I researched it, because as far as I know is that there's general understandings about it, there's general statements about it, people understand it. And so I had titled my original presentation, Liming Then and Now, but I think that I should have titled it Liming Then and Now and Forever, because I believe that within liming itself, that something essential is constructed in maintaining how Caribbean society expresses itself. So I started by looking at liming itself. I wanted to know, what is its purpose? Does it serve a purpose, if anything? Because as far as we know, it's a custom of social practice. And by a custom of social practice, all we can say is that there's definitions that people agree about it. Even some Westerners understand that, Caribbean people lime. There's not necessarily a definitive sort of understanding about it, but it's almost the same way as nationalism. And what I mean by that is, some historians have said for nationalism, for example, when people act in the ways that sort of appropriate the end goals of nationalism, they don't necessarily know what they're doing in the moment. If you ask them to describe exactly what it is, they won't be able to describe it, but they can tell you what it is that they are trying to agree upon. And so when I looked at liming, I realized there was something about the one thing that was necessary was the idea of community. And I feel that, let me just see here. Yeah, exactly. So looking at community, my research led me to the debates between liberalism and communitarianism. And if we look at the debates within liberalism, for example, the idea of community is not necessary, because the main idea is to create a public square that is devoid of prior moral or political ties, and to only structure a public square that that achieves ends without the means, just meaning that there's no sort of purposive direction in a liberal state. And if we look at, say we look at Europe even today, or a lot of other countries, there's a general attempt to try to draw people out of their homes to create the idea of community, to try and tie a political idea to the local commonalities and the local relationships that actually structure a sort of that structures society. So what I'm trying to say is this, is that when we look at the importance of community, we can see that in some places, like in Europe, for example, there's a lack of community in public discourse. So what I mean by that is that there's generally a liberal state. In the liberal state, the idea is pure neutrality, not to promote a public good in any sort, but to simply just provide ends without means, to try to provide a state that there's no sort of public good that creates those ends. And this is what I'm trying to say, is that essentially when we look at something like the Caribbean, for example, we can see that certain things like liming, they draw people out, right? If we look at, like in Europe, for example, look at something like public transportation. The massive idea behind public transportation is to draw people out of their homes and to even create cities that aren't dominated by cars and stuff. It's the idea is to create a community that people can that they can gather in. I'm sorry, I don't have my notes in front of me, but the point is that I'm trying to say is that when we look at liming, I don't want to say that it serves an institutional role. I would say this. I would say when we look at the idea of institutions, institutions are more determined by the local communities and the local commonalities more than those institutions. Those institutions were created to sort of streamline sort of an ideal. And the point is that when we look at certain features of communal societies, there is yeah. So the point is this. This is the point.
Josh, you have 30 seconds to go.
Okay. My point is that liming serves a necessary purpose. It sort of strengthens civic institutions because it creates a sort of public discourse around the ideas of community. And those things are adopted at the political level, at the national level. And if you look at the Caribbean, for example, there's a lot of national holidays. And the reason there's a lot of national holidays is because the government is trying to create a corresponding political formation to the communities and the local identities that make it up. I don't have my notes in front of me, unfortunately. I had to give this. So that's it. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Josh. I appreciate it. We will now move on to Suzanne and Ryan.
Everyone, my name is Suzanne. Greetings from Toronto, Canada. It is not that warm here. It's sunny where the sun is deceiving and the wind is cold. Ryan unfortunately had another presentation at this time, so my presentation will be a little bit shorter. And we're going to be talking about mashup. So I have some of the notes here from him as well. So Ryan and I originally came to our earliest thinking around this project through art and activism in the Greater Toronto Area in Ontario, Canada. So Ryan works as a PhD student, educator, and drag artist, and I'm also a PhD student, educator, and community organizer. Ryan and I were originally approached to contribute to this collection after one of the editors came across a piece that Ryan wrote over the summer for Gay City News in New York about Caribbean drag artists, solidarity and political action. In it, Ryan describes how Caribbean drag artists across numerous gender and sexual identities and practices think through the mashup as a method of performing the self, where the connections, interstices, and collisions and crossings of masculinities and femininities come in conversation with one another to unpack the ideas about Caribbean ideologies of gender and sexual subjectivity. However, the mashup does not operate through monolithic definitions and carry different functions. Ryan also thinks about how such acts of crossing engage the mashup as transgression, where rules and regulations of gendered and sexual normalcy is being critiqued and resisted. The multiplicity of mashup can be seen as a means to speak to the hybridities, diversities that shape the historical and contemporary ecological conditions of the Caribbean. So in my work, I use the mashup as a way to understand the multiple sites of crossing that Indo-Caribbean women experience organizing in the diaspora of Toronto, particularly the Jane and Finch community. The Jane and Finch community is described as a working class neighborhood and primarily taken up as a criminalized space. Conceptually, Indo-Caribbean women are understood as apolitical and their activism is relegated to the domestic sphere. I argue that in the diaspora, something different is happening for Indo-Caribbean women. They're working, organizing, and living in ethnically diverse communities and forming intimate kinship relations across various race, class, and gender differences in a way that may not have been possible in the Caribbean, and are being political in very public ways, performing activism through art and theater. I see the diaspora as a site where the mashup of cultures and identities exist and work to resist the ways in which they are collectively they collectively experience discrimination, exploitation, and state-based violence. And this can be seen through, police violence, poverty, food, apartheid, economic injustice, and things of that nature. What's unique also about this community is that through these intimate relations, I argue that there is the Caribbean yard that reinvents itself in the diaspora. And this kind of traveling through space and migration has allowed for this mashup of identity and reimagining culture in the diaspora. So that's all we have for right now. Thank you all so much. And it's a pleasure to be a part of this today.
Thank you, Susan. Quite interesting. All right. I just want to thank our presenters, Veronica, Josh, and Susan, for your wonderful contributions. Listening to you and the three methods that have been presented is quite interesting, quite intriguing, and I'm sure the audience wants to hear more. I have one. I know persons wanted to hear further from Veronica. I'm not sure if there's a question that's specific for Veronica's yet, but I'm noting that there is a question specific to you, Suzanne. What would be the characteristics of mashup as method?
Well, we're still outlining some of these very particular characteristics, but some of the things that we noted both in drag work and organizing work is that there is this liminal space of difference and performativity that doesn't necessarily exist in mainstream culture or mainstream methods in understanding Caribbean identity and performance. So I guess that's sort of our intervention at the moment, and we're still thinking through and talking about how both drag performance and performing being political has a very particular Caribbean essence in the subjects that we're looking at. So we're trying to understand how we can use mashup in the diasporic Caribbean community.
Okay. Thank you, Susan. I have another question for you here, or a series of questions, but I'll field them to you one at a time. How does mashup transform the dynamics of doing research in comparison with mainstream methods?
Oh, my apologies. I read that question. That's the one that I just previously answered.
All right. So let's is there another question for you? No. All right. So take a pause, Susan. Moving on to you now, Veronica. The question to you is, what does the metaphor you presented tell us about research in non-Western context?
In non-Western context, I am particularly playing with the idea of the non-Western context. I'm connecting it with Alatus's 2004 idea of the post-colonial scholar as having a captive mind. The same thing that because we do not have the intellectual autonomy of the person who is domiciled in the West and acting within the West and in their own institution. So this is my core thing. I'm using the folk tale. I'm finding in the story, like the left-handed king, these little analogies that are tools for questioning the normative orientation, the captive mind, the unquestioning, the tendency to imitate without question the received methods. And then not to take, and in the process, because we are so attuned, or we so, I said, genuflect to the methodologies we learn in the foreign universities, we do not, we do what Alatus say, we do not modify them to the post-colonial, to the local context. And so we go like Quadwo, we immerse ourselves in a very thorough inquiry, come up with conclusions only for the sake of coming up with a conclusion, and not necessarily, as Dr. The first presentation said, having the moral dimension to what we study, but it's more like a technical rationality requirements that we satisfy.
Okay. I have another question for you, Veronica. In relation to your abstract, which states you use meanings in folk tales as devices of interrogation. Just clarify for us, what do you mean by interrogation?
Okay, so what I've actually done is interrogated the very questions asked. For example, as a matter of fact, all the studies, my main study is on assessment and teacher education. So all the studies that have looked into assessment in the local context, Brown et al. Is one interesting one. Interestingly, the next one I'm looking at is Nakid et al. Also looked at the effects of ethnic, one might call ethnic exclusion based on the end of the secondary examinations and so on, qualifying examinations. So I am, instead of simply reading the text as it is, critiquing, I am applying the folk tale, the themes in the folk tale to illuminate, you might say, all right, some of the questionable assumptions in the local research. I hope that answered the questions. Basically, it's like, the best I can do is equivalent to, if you see talking about the fable of the dog and the bone, or the Good Samaritan, you say, this is a case of the Good Samaritan, or this is the point that I want to get to, where we become so familiar with these old folk tales that we use them as thinking devices, as thinking tools to interpret or to respond to what we come across, what we do locally and regionally.
Okay. And the final question for you, Veronica, thank you for that, by the way. Well, if not the final question, I have another question here for Josh. So I'm gonna field another one to you, Veronica, and then Josh. What was your reason for applying the contrapuntal reading to the article selected?
Right, so the contrapuntal reading, I always take a stance. I say I'm nothing if not critical. And so I'm reading and I find that I cannot read the articles positivistically. I cannot simply do a paraphrase. I need an interpretive tool, very much like how you invoke parables to interpret. And so that's the question I see that Susan Herbert asked. What was my reason for applying? Because I found that a simple, dry, typical literature review, where you simply summarize or paraphrase, mere paraphrase, was not sufficient to me. My study is very much interpretive. So I want to interpret, and I also wanted to use storytelling as polemic. I'm taking a polemic approach. I'm raising issue, and I just find the storytelling, the story is a very convenient tool, and an indigenous tool at that, and it entails recovery of these old texts to recover, to reinstate indigenous ways of knowing, which is looking at life through the story, or just looking at reality through the story, and looking at text, particularly reading text using another text. And that's what the contrapuntal is, what Said does. He recovers stories from the past and read them in terms of the present.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. Thank you so much, Veronica. Josh, I hope you're still on with us to answer a few questions. Wonderful. So the first question to you, Josh, is what would you say is one thing liming as a communal practice tells us about doing research in Caribbean context?
I would say that in that regard, it can sometimes be almost a political question, because if you look at how institutions are organized today, the idea is generally, for the last like 20 years or so, that institutions are informed by the practices and the ideas that are going on in the communities. And those communities can be anything from civic institutions, like churches or church communal groups and so on. And the point is, that Liming, it serves to sort of reconstruct ideas about the common good. What I mean by the common good is that things that the state should produce to sort of make life conducive to what local communities and commonalities find desirable. And if we look at the Caribbean, for example, we know that there's many national holidays, and those national holidays are less about the idea of the idea about the nation is, it's less about the ideal of the nation than, say, in Western societies. What I mean by this is that Western societies are struggling generally to create a form of, to sort of draw out communities and to sort of connect a politics to the local sources of the communities that really make up politics. If we look at politics in in America and in parts of Europe, it sort of just creates a naked public square where the only idea is that the state should be neutral to ends, and in other words, that the state shouldn't provide any institutions to create sort of desirable ends for people. But for example, if we look at parts of Southeast Asia, the newly industrialized countries, Taiwan, Singapore, and even in the Caribbean, we see that the state actually does act in ways that sort of create spaces that people can celebrate the communities that make up the larger politics. And so I would say that if you're asking me what the importance is of something like Liming, I would say that it serves to not just strengthen civic institutions like the local neighborhood, local church groups, even ethnic and linguistic communities, but those ideas from those local communities, they are universalized into the larger idea of the state, and the state then provides those things. They provide those goods that are necessary to achieve this larger good. And I truly believe that something like Liming, I don't think that Liming is an institution. I think that though maybe, if we look at debates about institutions, the idea is that institutions they're not impervious to the local communities and the local ideations of what these people at the local level want. Institutions can't streamline those things anymore. The fact is that since the 1980s or so, institutions have become, they sort of respond to the desires at the local level for a larger politics that responds to the response to the desires at the local level. And so I think that Liming, it obviously, I've been looking at it and it's been confusing me a lot because obviously we know it's a custom of social practice. I don't think it's not an institution, but I do believe that it serves to connect civic institutions in some ways. It serves to sort of have, to create the virtues and the ideas about the common good. What should the state be? We see that in the Caribbean, like in a lot of countries that respond to local, a lot of countries that base its politics and on the local, we see that they are better at responding to the deep pluralism of their society. They don't create a public square, for example, that is devoid of debating prior moral and political ties. They actually create a public square that's conducive to these things.
Thank you, Josh. We've unfortunately run out of time for the discussion. We will need to move on to the next section of the presentations. Yes. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Let me just add, Josh, that I think you answered
questions, and if the presenters could answer the questions in the chat as we move on. Thank you.
Right. So I was going to add that, Josh, thank you. You answered Camille's question as well, but if you could look at Nathan's question and answer in the chat, that would be great.
I'm sorry?
If you look in the chat, if you're able to look in the chat, I think you answered Camille's question as well in your response previously. But if you could look at the question that's posed by Nathan and answer in the chat, that would be great.
All right. Thank you all. We're on to our second stream, our second thematic stream, and on to you, Dr. Camille Nakit. Thank you. Camille, unmute.
Yep, we have 3 presenters, and we have Stanton, talking about Ubuntu, Heather, Michael, Kelly, I know both of them are there, Kiora, and Andre. So I'm going to start with Stanton. Off you go.
Kia ora, Stefano. My name is Stanton. So in continuing on from the African oral tradition, for our excellent presentation from Dr. Tue, I don't have a presentation, so I'll speak things through to you. I'll just get my notes up for you. So just a bit of background about who I am. I've been in New Zealand for 18 years now. And a bit about my story. I'm originally from South Africa. I'm mixed race South African. Classified as colored in the South African context. So if you know of Trevor Noah, the comedian, same but different. Trevor Noah's, one parent is black, another is white. Mine, on my father's side, it goes back 6 generations because racial classification in the South African context and under apartheid has been going for many generations. So my research is, I'll take this off. What it means to be colored outside of South Africa, because the term colored is very, it's controversial anywhere else, but in South Africa, and by extension in other parts of Southern Africa as well, it's accepted, but it's considered a racial slur anywhere else in the world. So I'm using Ubuntu as my research methodology for that. And Ubuntu explained by the isiXhosa proverb, Umuntu mumuntu ngabantu, translates to a person is a person through other persons. So everything we learn, everything we experience in the world is through our relationships with other people. And it's this concept that being human is not something we're born into, but it's something we develop through our relationships with others. So everything we do, it's about the power of community and belief in the power of community for us to achieve and for us to coexist and for us to really being able to live out our humanity. And Kenyan philosopher John Mbiti, he said something which is really relevant to the Ubuntu worldview, where he said, whatever happens to the individual happens to the whole group, and whatever happens to the whole group happens to the individual. So I think this is the concept of Ubuntu is something that is lived out in African communities across the continent. And it's about our relationships with each other, with people. But I think beyond that, it's also about our relationships with our ancestors, with the land, with the sea, you know, flora, fauna. So it's all encompassing in the way that we live our lives. So in terms of the way the Ubuntu research methodology would work, I'm still kind of, I'm working it out as I go, which is a very interesting process. And Camille has challenged me in all the right ways to push through on this. But it's really that community are the agenda setters, but as well, and beyond that, community is the agenda as well. So it's making sure with my research that for me to stay true to an Ubuntu research methodology, the community are part of every, involved in every part of the process. So in terms of the research method that I'm doing for this, I'm using an indigenous research method as well. And I'm going to be hosting at my own home a Shisanyama or a braai, which is in South Africa and in Southern Africa, and all of Africa really is something that would be done regularly, where you'd invite family and friends over to your home. You would share a meal around the fire, so it's cooked over a charcoal fire, meat and traditional foods as well. And then everyone will share in debates and conversation around the fire. So kind of like an African sharing circle, we're talking about it in the research context. So with this, it's a really important part of the Ubuntu research methodology because back home, welcoming people into your home is showing, it's a sense of hospitality where like, it really shows that relationship, and that's what this is about as well. So with the topics of discussion for the Shisanyama, when I'm doing my data collection, I've got the community involved in helping me formulate that, because it's about lived experience. So those topics of discussion, I've got a view, I've got my own lived experience being colored South African, but that's just one. So I want to make sure that the community are involved in the process. There's no time limit that's set for it as well. So it could go on for as long as possible, which in some instances it may go on for 5 or 6 hours, but that's it. It's fluid, and the conversations, one would lead to the next. It's just about me making sure that whatever topics of discussion I've got planned, that we do end up speaking about them in some way, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't need to be in a linear form or anything like that.
Anton, you have 30 seconds to go.
Sorry, I've just a bit stopped. And in terms of the data collection as well, there was something that I was looking at, and Camille challenged me well on that one, where I was looking at doing data collection that might have compromised the Ubuntu research methodology. So again, if community is the purpose and is the point of Ubuntu, then the data collection needs to speak to that as well. So in terms of that, the community will be involved in the data collection, where they can note which themes or which topics of discussion were most relevant to them, and that would inform my findings, and would inform what themes I speak about in my findings. So it's all a bit of a work in progress, but it's coming together slowly, and with Camille's guidance and really valuable input.
Thank you, Stanton. And next we have Heather and Kelly, and I don't think Michael is there. Heather, are you there?
Tēnā koutou katoa ko Heather De Vere taku ingoa. So I'm Heather De Vere, and Kelly, Dr. Kelly Tamaiharoa and I are here. We also, on behalf of our colleague, Dr. Michael Lingalinga, we're looking at how our discipline of peace and conflict studies could be decolonized with the use of Indigenous methods of research. And what we do in our paper is we look at the work of 14 doctoral studies that link peace and conflict studies and Indigenous methods. And the researchers are all involved in PhDs at the National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The Māori name that was gifted to the centre is Te O Rongo, which means the space for peace. So it actually doesn't mention conflict in the Māori name, and we've used that as the title for our paper. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Kelly Tamaiharoa, and she's tangata whenua from Aotearoa, and her iwi or tribe, Waitaha, has a very long peace tradition. She's going to provide us with insight into the use of kaupapa Māori as a methodology to explore the peace traditions of Aotearoa. And if there's time, I'll just give a short summary of some of the other work. So kia ora, Kelly.
Kia ora, thank you, Heather. Tēnā koutou katoa, ka mihi aroha ki a koutou. Ko waio, ko auraki te mauka, ko waitaki te awa, ko urua o te waka, ko rākai hautu te takata, ko Tamaiharoa te purakiti. So greetings to you all. I'm really enjoying listening to your presentations, and thank you for hosting this. So my people arrived on the shores from Hawaii about 1,200 years ago. And my ancestor Tamaharoa, so he was born in the late 1700s and passed away in about 1886. So he was the last Māori tohoko or specialist priest and Māori prophet in the South Island. So I have the pleasure of having his name, Tamaharoa. So yeah, we've been here about 1200 years. We have, there's no war artifacts for our periods of occupation. We were a peaceful tribe. And then northern tribes came down and there was some interesting interactions there. But for me, what Heather, I met Heather in 2012 and it was really, she invited me to do my PhD with her and the National Centre of Peace and Conflict Studies. My interest was around recording peace traditions, looking at historically what's happened in the South Island, but then also in terms of going forward, what that might look like. So the basis of my research was we were retracing the ancestral footsteps of our prophet. So he led a Te Heke, which is a migration of people. There's up to 600 people in the South Island, relocated from the eastern townships in the South Island into the hinterlands as protection against diseases with colonial contact, and also to protect Māori language and culture. So when I was doing my PhD, I wanted to revive our ancient ways of protecting our stories and handing it on to the next generation. So I used the methodology, kaupapa Māori method, obviously because it's a good cultural fit for what I was doing, but also the method of pūrākau, which is storytelling. So as we recreated the heke, the migration, I invited whānau or family to keep a journal, and we called them whānau journals or family journals, and it enabled people to record their experiences in a lived experience on the way. We walked 135 kilometres, which was 135 years since Tamaharoa had led that journey. So at the end of it, I had 10 journals, 5 from men, 5 from females, from that journey. So I used that as part of my methodology and methods. I also interviewed kaumātua, which is our elders. One of the stories that we created is we looked at the history together, and then we thought, what would our vision look like for us in the future? So we co-created a story or our vision for the future. That was one of my chapters. Another one of my chapters was I interviewed a kaumātua, my auntie Sissy Tamaharoa Dodds. And as she talked, her life kind of unfolded. And I didn't know exactly what method that would fit, because it's not about fitting our people into methodologies.
You have 30 seconds to go, Kelly.
I think that's frozen.
Oh, she's frozen.
But I worked with Heather and 2 other Indigenous people, Maui Solomon and Marta Wharihuka, and we collaboratively wrote about peace traditions in Aotearoa. So kia ora, I'll hand back to Heather. Sorry, Heather, for taking all that time.
No, thank you. So just to wrap up, we've got people from cultures of Maori Samoan, Palestinian, Myanmar, Kenyan, Afghani, Fiji, Indian, and Iranian, and other cultures that are part of the studies are the Lumad people of the Philippines, the Chamorro people of the Northern Marianas. And so we will be writing this up, looking at the Indigenous methods that these different students have used.
Okay, thank you very much, Heather, and thank you very, very much, Kelly. It's as Anna says, good to have our Aotearoa representing. Okay, and our final speaker in this team is Andre, who has also been a student here in Aotearoa. Andre, are you there? Yeah.
Yes, kia ora everyone. So I'm gonna be presenting on the topic exploring the intersectionality between Caribbean research methodologies and Kapapa Māori research methodologies. So yeah, let's see here. Right, so just an outline of the presentation. I'll be looking at the context and rationale for this presentation. I'll be reviewing both methodologies, then looking deeper at this question of intersectionality, and then concluding. So what's the context? Why compare Caribbean research methodologies with Kapapa Māori? And for me, looking at the early literature from both fields, the realization is that CRM is an emerging field, and because of the context of CRM is really to challenge Western ways of knowing. And this is exactly what Kapapa Māori methodologies do. So therefore, Caribbean research methodologies as a growing field in the social sciences can actually benefit from established indigenous methodologies. And one of the oldest and most cemented indigenous practices is actually Kapapa Māori research. Of course, given that, and my basic thesis is that given that Kapapa Māori has had the benefit of time and sustained practice, it can provide learnings and ideas for Caribbean research methodologies. So that's the context. And just to look at some of the seminal works. So Graham Hingagoroa Smith first identified, the 6 principles, and that work sort of grew with work from Linda Smith and other theories such as Russell Bishop, who is, one of the most quoted voices in terms of Kapapa Māori theory and methodology. So those are some of the seminal works. And in terms of Caribbean research methodologies, I don't think I need to speak about these, seeing that the authors and progenitors of Caribbean research methodologies are all present on this call today. So moving on now to just quickly review both methodologies, I'll start with Kapapa Māori. So the key elements, of course, there's the element, the principle of self-determination, which speaks about the fact that Māori control their own culture and aspirations, and the idea of basing research, doing research by Māori for Māori is to reclaim their power as a people. There's the principle of cultural aspiration, where the paradigm of Kapapa Māori is basically to reinforce the legitimacy of Te Reo Māori, which is the language, and Tikanga and Mataranga Māori, which speaks to Māori knowledge and Māori ways of knowing and doing and ways of understanding the world. The other principle is the principle of culturally preferred pedagogy. So culture matters. And this is something that Māori try to emphasize in all that they do, that look, who we are as a people matters and it cannot be ignored. The principle of socioeconomic mediation. The principle here is that research, Māori research, should benefit Māori people. I mean, in New Zealand, one of the first things you will hear when you visit is just the terrible statistics about Māori in terms of social and economic statistics. And Māori have been trying to address that you know, that stigma against them in terms of the fact that the social and economic statistics are always never favorable towards Maori. And so one of the principles—
30 seconds to go, sorry.
Oh, wow. So yeah, I haven't, yeah, so I'm just going to go quickly here. So there's the principle of the extended family structure, the principle of collective philosophy, the principle of the Treaty of Waitangi, the principle of respectful relationships. And then quickly just to review Caribbean research methodologies. Of course, it's about employing Caribbean ways of knowing and thinking. And the whole idea is Caribbean research for Caribbean, by Caribbean researchers for Caribbean people. So looking at just the points of convergence, so both research methodologies speak to having a framework that is culturally relevant. Both speak to doing research for the Caribbean, by the Caribbean, and then for Maori, by Maori. So it's really putting the people at the focus of your research. And then both research challenges Western ways of knowing. And because I've run out of time, I'm just going to conclude and say that both methodologies in their own unique ways contend with Western colonial legacy that continues to affect indigenous peoples. And as I started with my thesis, that Kaupapa Māori has had the benefit of time and sustained practice and has a lot of lessons to offer to Caribbean research methodology as an emerging field in the social sciences. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andre, if you can stop your screen sharing, that would be great.
Yeah.
Okay, now I'll just open it up and Anna will let me know when it's 10 seconds. I do apologize for the brevity of it all, but we are an online seminar, and so I'll just start with questions for Stanton. Stanton, could you tell us how your the practices of Ubuntu are shown in the actual research?
Oh, yes. So this is in terms of like the Shisanyama as well, the method.
Yeah, but also how you can bring the Ubuntu to actual life, to life in the actual research process.
Yeah. I think a key with that is the method. So the Shisanyama, having that. So it really there's a lot of values that are lived out in Ubuntu, and with the Shisanyama method, it speaks to the value of hospitality. So one of the issues that I've had is there's been maybe a resistance, like with ethics, for me to host it in my own home, but for me to stay true to that Ubuntu framework, it would need to be in my own home, because I would need to welcome them into a space that's personal and that's meaningful to me.
Yes.
So that's important. And it's also about sharing also about sharing a meal together is about this value in Ubuntu of coming together and living in community, and also that like knowledge is not generated like individually, like one person personally, but it's through this communal discourse that we have. And I think with the method, that's really what's it about. It's just about having everyone speak openly and freely. And I think meeting people where they are, in the sense that they are in an environment that's comfortable for them, like what this whole seminar is about. It's something that's culturally affirming, so they don't feel like they have to present themselves in a way for research purposes.
Yeah, I just cut you short, really Santan. Santan, just a quick question. For how, in your ethics application process with liming, we have food and alcohol. And in your ethics application for your Shisa Niyama, you also have alcohol, and ethics have said you can't have that. So how do you get around ethics telling you one thing when and contrast and contradicting what your cultural practices?
Yeah, I think it's like you pointed out to me, I think it's just using examples, because one of the struggles with the Ubuntu methodology is it hasn't been used much before, but I don't think that that's a reason why I shouldn't use it. I think it's actually more incentive for me to use it so that going forward, others can make, there'll be more legitimacy for others to use it as well. But like pointing to Anna's research, for example, is something that's really valuable to show that this is something that has been used in Indigenous research in another context. And it's worked, it hasn't been controversial, it hasn't caused any issues.
All right.
And I think making them aware of that.
Thank you. And just a reminder to the audience to pose your questions in the chat. It can come from everyone, not just the presenters, organizers. A question for you, Kelly and Heather. How do you see your practices relevant to all the other practices we're talking about, Caribbean practices and African practices? And what similarities do you see? What connections do you see? Kelly and Heather, are you there?
Yeah. Do you want to answer that, Kelly?
Sure. I can see synergies with pretty much every presentation that has been given today, and I think that Stanton, I think, made the reference, and our earlier presenter, about kaupapa theory, so it does have some decades behind it, and potentially aspects of it that can be used or leveraged for new and emerging Indigenous methodologies.
At the moment.
Sorry, is that what you asked, Camille?
Yes. What sort of synergies do you see? Heather, do you want to jump in, Kelly? What synergies are you actually seeing?
If I can just...
You breaking up, Kelly. Heather, you might want to jump in for Kelly.
And close.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of similarities, particularly about the relationships and the way in which people interact and the ethical component of the research, the research being for the people that are being researched, not for the researcher and the institution. And I think that's one of the big differences. And I think that it's informing what we're doing. And that's with our paper, what we want to do is make sure that the student work, and it's the student work, it's not the work of the academics and the faculty that is informing this practice. It comes through the students in the majority of cases.
Okay, thank you for that.
Sorry, I think you were frozen for a while.
Yes, and I did ask, Kelly sent it to me privately, and I'm going to make it public. What she said, some of the synergies was that about affirming identity and reclaiming the research space for Indigenous people. I'm going to put that in the chat. Now, question for Andre, or no, for Andreas. Andre, how have you found bringing the research projects, bringing these specific cultures together? And do they take pains to justify bringing them together? Do you have to always have that justification for them?
No.
Oh, sorry, Andre, yes?
Yes, I mean, because of the synergies between the methodologies, it's not very difficult to, as I argue, to see the intersectionality between them. And I don't think there's much justification needed, because both methodologies are about affirming Indigenous identity. And I think that's a justification in and of itself, to say, because as an Indigenous person, I should have the right to reclaim my culture in conducting research. And I think that's a justification enough.
Right. Thank you, Andre. And I've just been notified by Anna. That's the end of the discussion. Look, if you look at the chat, there's so many questions there that I and everyone else would love answers to. And we also will get a copy of the chat. So please respond if the questions are for you. I see some there for Kelly, for Stanton, for Andre. So if you can respond to those people who have asked you those questions. And I want to thank very much the speakers, Stanton, Kelly, Heather, Michael in his absence, and Andre. Thank you very much, and I'll pass it over to Margaret.
I think the next session in the program is theme 3, and it's dissemination of research, ensuring access to Caribbean methodologies and research. The presentations in this section are by Heather Murphy and Marsha Brown. Marsha Brown is a doctoral candidate at the University of the West Indies, and Heather is a lifelong educator with a deep commitment to the social and emotional and academic development of young people. So Heather, you're the first presenter, over to you.
Anna, just a minute, is Yentil's presentation? Are you presenting Yentil? Yes, so Yentil is also included as part of this.
Yes, Heather is the first presentation, yes, and Yentil.
My apologies, Yentil. Yes, you are next after Marsha Brown.
Go ahead. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good night. My name is Heather Murphy, and as Margaret, I think it's Annabelle, introduced me. I am actually a head of a department in a secondary school in Trinidad and Tobago. And several years ago, I completed my doctorate in educational studies through the University of Sheffield. And one of my pet peeves, my interest, is in school leadership and management. And my particular presentation this afternoon is based on my doctoral study, which is entitled Overseers or Advocates, an exploration of heads of departments and deans in secondary schools in Trinidad and Tobago. And I know I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to go as fast as I can. So I'm going to share my screen now. Oops, sorry. Oops, I'm trying to get my screen going. Just a second. Okay, is my screen up now? I don't think anything is showing.
Not yet. We're not seeing your screen.
Not yet? Okay.
Give it another go.
Seeing it now? Right? Seeing
Yes.
it now?
Going through.
Right. Okay, so this was my doctoral thesis. It's actually a modification of my doctoral thesis because 5 minutes is not quite a lot of time. So my research on middle leadership in secondary schools, I'm not sure if I should actually show the full screen, right? Yes, so I begin with looking at research done on school leadership and management in the Caribbean has focused primarily on principals. And as a middle manager myself, I decided that my study should be on or located in what I'm familiar with and what I am actually doing as a middle manager. So in the late 1990s, Trinidad and Tobago embarked on a widespread reform of its secondary education sector. And this was known as SEMP, the Secondary Education Modernization Program. It was funded by the Interdevelopment Bank, and it was really a reorganization of the secondary school sector and the introduction of school-based management. And with the introduction of school-based school-based management. This is where a new tier of administrators, school leadership, or I should say managers, took effect. So this is actually a sort of visual representation of our education system. The Ministry of Education is the controlling body. They vision, they policy make, they are engaged in strategic planning, etc. Below them are educational district officers, known as school supervisors, who are actually a support for school districts. And then schools, and at that level, the schools are, traditionally were organized according to principal, vice principal, teachers. I'm not including ancillary staff, students, etc. I'm just looking at the management structure of the schools. With school-based management and through SEMP, this is the new structure. Below the vice principal, a new group of middle managers came into existence. Now, school managers in the past were really just the principal and vice principal in an informal atmosphere, and I guess thanks to the goodwill of senior teachers, they took on the responsibilities in some schools of becoming heads and deans, and that is informal. It was never an official position. However, after school-based management came into effect, these were legitimate posts with job specs. People who were already acting or who were interested became, and who were eligible, applied and were appointed. If they passed the exam, it was really an interview. When we talk about deans in secondary schools, we're really talking about people who are responsible for monitoring the academic performance and discipline of a group of students in forms 1 to 6. That's taken from the Ministry of Education's guidelines on the operation of schools. They're also known as deans of discipline. The heads of department, those are responsible for the supervision of teachers and curriculum delivery. In my study, I decided to question, well, heads and deans, middle managers, middle leaders, how do the personal beliefs, values, and attitudes of those who are given this responsibility influence and shape the everyday practice?
Heather, heads up that you have 1 minute to go.
Oh my God, already? Oh my God. So do the practices of deans and heads in secondary schools reflect that of the overseer or advocate? And more importantly, the theory of the inner plantation, does it provide a decolonizing framework for the exploration of the practices of deans and heads? So I'm just going to flip forward. So the use of non-Indigenous theory to explore middle leadership. Why? Why should we? And I'm quoting from Laurette Bristol's 2012 study, and she says, the failure to recognize the value of Indigenous ways of knowing to the design of research further the maintenance, reproduction, and dominance of westernized ways of coming to know the world through conducting research. And hence my choice of the theory of the inner plantation, coming out of Edward Kamau Brafitt's Caribbean Man in Space and Time in 1975. And that provided the framework for my analysis of the beliefs, values, and the resulting practices of middle managers in secondary schools. Okay. And what it's actually an Indigenous theoretical framework that it's a counter narrative to current imported management practices. And it's rooted in the scholarship of as way back as in the 1970s with Sylvia Winter, Brafitt, Henk Cook, right up to Lavier, Berinato, Bristol in present time. Okay, how much time do I have?
You've run out of time, unfortunately, Heather. Do you want to say some closing remarks?
Yes, I just want to say that the findings really, the 4 people who I interviewed, because I used the life history approach, was very fruitful, time consuming, but very fruitful, because at the end of it, what I concluded through my findings is that they have taken on more the advocate role rather than the overseer role. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather, for that presentation, and I'm sure there will be some questions coming to you. Next up is Marsha Brown, and she's going to share the vernacular use of a tool for exploring HIV positive and negative women breastfeeding experiences. Marsha Brown is a doctoral candidate at the University of the West Indies. Marsha, over to you.
How old am I? As old as I look, 20.
We cannot see you in your
You can't see me?
No.
I think I just did the video. You can see me now?
We can hear you. We're gonna see your face. Are you sharing? You're not sharing your screen, are you?
I'm going to share a screen.
Okay,
but
well, see your face, be aware of that.
All right, I'll be aware of that. Just for the interest of time, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marsha Brown. I'm a PhD candidate, Department of Sociology, Psychology, and Social Work. And my focus is PhD in sociology, specialization in demography. So even though I'm into demography, which is basically a quantitative PhD, I still have a strong appreciation for qualitative research, and especially for the application of HIV, because it's such a sensitive matter. So as said before, my topic is a vernacular use as a tool exploring HIV positive and negative women breastfeeding experiences. And I came up with a subtitle called Speaking the Dialect. So one of the main things that I want to go to in the interest of time is what everyone has been talking about, decolonizing research. And I found C. Howard has used the term as moving away from that which is acceptable, and for us to come into a level of freeing of our minds. You know, Bob Marley said, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. This is important because in our mainstream research, we have certain language that we use. For example, we talk about natives instead of citizens. And there's a need, therefore, for a paradigm shift, you know, move away from the usual agenda where we talk about things like, you know, research subjects, and no more talk about experts, because even with Sihaher in her work, she had realized about the Ubuntu people is that their lived experiences is what she's learning from. And so not much that she's observing a research subject to just take a note and then she becomes the expert. But she's the one who is actually in the position of learning, and they are the experts. So at each point in time in our research, in Caribbean research methodology, in moving away or decolonizing our research, we should see those that we are getting a deeper understanding of as experts on their own experiences, and we become learners. Therefore, it is important for us not to impose our own language, our own socioeconomic dialect. And this is important for the Caribbean because different socioeconomic backgrounds have different dialects. You know, working class has one dialect, middle class individuals have another. You know, they may speak more Jamaican English, and you know, more when you go to the upper class, you may speak even a mixture between what is considered standard English and Jamaican English, and amongst the working class and the poor, you may have more of what we call patois. When this imposition is done of the researcher, wherever, if it's researchers going on from the upper class to the working class, when that imposition is done, it creates a divide. And that divide affects what we consider to be the research space. So even with the work, if you are more familiar with the work of John Swales about creating research spaces, he brings out the whole point that the research space begins from the very write-up, from the very conception, and it ends in the dissemination of information. We have a tendency sometimes to actually go out, and actually want to say, focus on the language that is done by the funders or the sponsors and write our research tool and even in our dialogue with persons, which creates a lack of fluency in communication. It makes them feel at times that they have to they have to be trying to impress the researcher, and that creates a level of divide. Therefore, to improve on community identification, which improves on the relationship, trust relationship between learner and experts, the dialect, the vernacular is important of the community. And so it also means, therefore, that when we speak as the persons we are interviewing or the persons we are learning from speak, we are also being able to have a better social connection, and they will be more open, and we have a better, what you say now, a more accurate understanding of results of what we believe is their lived experiences. So in a situation where it comes on to a sensitive matter as breastfeeding, women do not have to think that they have to cover up how they feel in any way they want to express it, and therefore it allows for a greater comparison. This is just a synopsis of my proposal so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Masha. You actually had 20 seconds left. That is some serious powerful synthesis there, my friend. Congratulations. It was a really good presentation, and I'm sure there will be some questions coming to you. So next up in our lineup is Gentile Williams, who is a PhD researcher in the University of Bristol, and she's working with another group of researchers looking into Walter Rodney's groundings. Excuse me. Walter Rodney's groundings as an affirmative methodology and a tool for critical decolonial pedagogy. So over to you, Gentile.
Kia ora, greetings from Bristol in the UK. And so I will be presenting with my colleagues. One can't be here, so I will share her presentation now. I think. Does that work? Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay.
Yeah, it's coming through.
Yes. So she introduced, and then I will give introduce the second part of our work, which is on methods, and then my colleague Chevy will add his 2 cents.
Greetings, greetings. It is really unfortunate that I cannot be here to take part in these discussions, but very grateful that I have the opportunity to contribute. My name is Alima, and I've been taking part in some of these conversations, thinking about how we can re-territorialize Walter Rodney's groundings. And for me, it's important to start and to begin by contextualizing the environment and the socio-economic landscapes that groundings emerged in Jamaica. And whilst I haven't got the time to delve into the details of the shifts and the developments that took place prior to Rodney's stay in Jamaica, from independence to a national state of emergency by the end of the decade, I think it's important to see the 1960s as representing a critical moment in the coming out of racial politics in Jamaica. And so when Rodney had returned in 1968, he became confronted with a fractured society stamped by neocolonialism, which had widened the standards between rich and poor. Jamaica's political independence from Britain had given rise to a petite bourgeoisie made up of property class of whites, Chinese, Jews, Syrians, who all sought to exploit the peasant and the working classes. During this period, we see Blackness emerging as central to the experiences of Black people. This wasn't just about race as an idea, but also touched upon race as a reality, in what Rodney said, imposed by the white world, which defines who is white and who is Black. So within this context, the Rastafari had naturally stood out to Rodney because of their determination to culturally and historically reconstruct society by centering the Black experiences. For Rodney, Rastafari were moving against the currents of an oppressive and capitalist government and creating their own ways of knowing and being, whilst at the same time remaining resourceful in their livelihood. And this, for me, becomes the starting point for thinking about groundings and indigenous research methodologies within the Caribbean radical imagination. How can we reimagine a decolonizing practice that moves beyond seeing whiteness as its starting point? How can we foreground a radical way of knowing into thinking about Black futures? And what does redistributive justice look like within the context of academic work? Thank you.
Okay, so you should have me back on your screen now. What I'm going to share at this point is the methods of how we went about our 3 reasoning sessions. So the groundings is our methodology, and it's based on the definition provided by Rodney, rooted in exchange of knowledge between the academy and the community. It's not about privileging the academic knowledge, but re-territorializing our understanding. So that's how we invited participation amongst ourselves. And then the reasoning is our method, and that as such guides data collection. So the definition that we use of reasoning is a horizontal exchange in a free-flowing, fluid and non-hierarchical manner. So over the past few months, the 3 researchers, I say researchers, but of course we are more than researchers, and we are brought together due to our shared background, having Rastafari upbringing, and also currently all 3 of us are based in so-called Western context doing PhD research. So we conducted 3 Rasta reasonings, as we call them, over the past few months, and 3 key elements emerged that we want to share with you. So the first one was, in this space, it allowed for a consensus of approaches. So that was from the way we organized when we would meet to how we discussed certain issues. It wasn't conflictual. And even if we came from different angles, by the end of it, we reasoned and understood each other. And then second is the overstanding. That's the Rastafari term for the understanding. We change the terminology, so we're overstanding certain phrases and language we use because we've grown up using this language, and we bring it into how we might write, for example. So when we would approach writing an academic text, as 3 authors, we choose not to use we, but we use the Rastafari I and I, which has some similarities to the Ubuntu philosophy. And then thirdly, the third key element is it's a safe space. We really felt that as researchers, and again, being more than researchers, we could share things in a very safe manner, sharing information, contacts, reading lists, and also just provide support for each other, given that we are maybe have more radical backgrounds than our research allows us to express on a daily basis. So how does this contribute to knowing, teaching, and learning? Well, for us, the knowing is within us. It's part of our ontology. The teaching is our overstanding, the epistemology, and the learning is this virtuous circle whereby teaching, knowing, and learning are all continually in exchange as part of groundings. And now I will pass briefly over to Chevy if we have a bit of time remaining.
We have 15 seconds to do some closing remarks, but over
Chevy?
to you.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just move on and fast forward. So what we try to do is try to see how we could apply grounding in a real sense. So the intention, how do we use grounding in the Caribbean reparations movement, right? So I'm just going to fast forward. So in summer of 2019, I had an opportunity to have a reasoning session on the Caribbean reparations movement in St. Mary's, Jamaica, at Black Space with people of African descent from Jamaica, Brazil, Canada, and the United States. The group makeup was diverse in regard to class, education, gender, religion, and nationality. However, most of the participants were of Jamaican heritage. I approached Black Space as an Afro, I'll say I, sorry about that. I approached Black Space as an Afro-Saint Lucian Canadian who is a graduate student in a Western institution and as an activist in the Caribbean reparations movement. However, because Black Space is a sanctuary for international reasoning sittings, my positionality was neutralized. The grounding session was an opportunity to hear directly from the members of civil society about the understanding to overstandings of Caribbean reparations. It was also an occasion to subvert the traditional teacher-student power dynamics that Yen and Alima broke down earlier on. And as such, space was created that allowed all parties to actively engage in the recreation of existing knowledges. The reasoning session was guided by the following questions. What does the idea of Caribbean reparations mean to you? What is the role of Rastafari philosophy in the reparations movement? What can we learn from Rodney Wright's in pursuing the reparation goals? In conclusion, the discussions led to more questions around the benefits of reparations in the neoliberal space. As a result, some of the questions that arose include, how do reparations benefit me? Are we supposed to rely on the government? Who are making the decisions for us? So these are some of the questions that that was developed in our discussion and how, and it will inform the way we move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chevy. And I know it's really hard to synthesize such a complex piece of ongoing research in 5 minutes. So thank you guys for doing your best to stick to times. And we're going to move to the discussion so we can elaborate on some of these issues. The first question that I have coming is for Masha, and it is, what would you advise a novice researcher to take into account regarding the connection between the use of language and the agency of the participants in the research process? So what is that connection that you have found?
I really find that is very important because the connection between language has to do with how you interpret the agency, right? If you interpret someone to be a research subject, you see them as more passive, you see them as just giving off watching, and then you interpret almost so very artificial to what the natural sciences do. But in the case where you understand that they're an expert, it becomes important. Later on in my presentation, I actually go into details to say that see how in her work, she actually did what you call a dissemination to the very same community that she was working with before. Because since they're the experts, they should know exactly what should be disseminated about them and should be disseminated in such a way that they agree with, because they are experts and not passive research subjects. So it's very important. You may not be able to go as far, since we're still in the process of decolonizing, as a expert researcher or more senior researcher, but you should always be considerate of the fact that persons you are in the process of learning and the individuals that you're working with, you're not studying them, they're experts that are telling you about their lived experiences.
Thank you very much, Masha. I could not agree more with you. A question for Gento and Chevy and your group. What would you say is the most significant shift that groundings as a research approach introduces when compared with mainstream methodologies? It may not be only one, but what would you say is the most significant shifts?
Yeah, feel free to answer.
I will just say briefly, and then Chevy, I'm sure you will complement it. But for me, it's this breakdown of the boundary between, and the hierarchies between academia and the so-called research community. And I think that's really where Alima, Chevy and I, we really connected. Alima and I, we've met in person. Chevy, we've all met online, but it's because we actually perhaps find sometimes that we are novel in our academic spaces. So we ourselves can represent this bridge between the so-called traditional academic community and also being part of what would have been a research community. So the fact that this is broken down and it's flat, there's fluid exchange, I think this is the most important contribution. And Chevy?
I'm actually going to build from what thank you, Jan, from what Tisalandi just mentioned, the quotes in the chat. The person mentioned that the Black intellectual, the Black academic must attach himself, herself, as well to the activity of the Black masses. And that's, that's the whole idea for grounding, right? And we had heavy conversations on what exactly is the Black intellectual, or what is the Black academic, or the radical intellectual and the guerrilla intellectual, and how is he linked from the systems that continue to produce a certain type of hierarchy of knowledge, and how do we get people who have been at the sidelines to participate in conversations in meaningful ways, right? So for me, it was the delinking and learning from the people, right? Especially when you're talking about, for example, the case study I used with Caribbean reparation. Caribbean reparation is a very important and powerful movement. However, civil society to a certain degree are not really aware of what's happening and who's leading it. And for them, they want to know what it's about, right? And one way in doing that is to actually put in the grounding praxis in practice, to understand and to learn from the people, to have that equal exchange. So your background in academics, wherever you are based on your gender, your class, your education, that has been neutralized, because like Amilcar Cabral said, you have to commit some form of class suicide, right? Or returning to the source.
Thank you, Chevy. Thank you. I know we could be speaking about this forever. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for the discussion, and we will need to move on to the next section of the program, which is a panel discussion, which will be shared by Dr. Margaret Nakhit-Chatur. Over to you, Margaret.
All right, again, welcome everybody, and we move on to our panel discussion with 5 of our researchers. In Trinidad and other Anglophone Caribbean islands, linguistic research has been investigating emerging standard varieties of English. There's also the interesting concept of transitional bilingualism, where Creole or Creolese is cautiously being accepted as the medium of expression for students until they develop sufficient skills in the use of standard English. Our speakers this afternoon, explorative researchers in their quest to move away from exonormative's reliance on foreign forms and customs of expression, and instead investigate endonormative approaches, that is, local forms and customs of linguistic expressions. So let us welcome Christian Ali, Ben Braffett, Ryan Durgesing, Samantha Jackson, Nisha Selvan Ramkisoon, who in this panel discussion will explore these new approaches, these interesting approaches to linguistic expressions. So I don't know who is going first.
Thank
Nisha,
you very much.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So I'll be starting. My name is Ryan Durgesing. And the overarching topic that we will all be discussing in some form will be about endonormative approaches to language research design in the Caribbean, something that we've been working on together as a group. So a bit of a preamble. So what we're talking about is using the growing body of work that is being done on endonormativity as a jumping off point. This paper seeks to extend the theoretical assumptions of structural language development to the actual practice of research. So moving away from more exonormative standards, that is more foreign orientations towards methodological approaches for linguistic analysis, we are now interested in the local norm developing methodologies that might be pioneering in certain fields. Our focus on 3 linguistic subdisciplines will serve to underscore this as fundamental issues related to norm orientation as it pertains to methodology within our contexts and the overall need for research design that is culturally focused. A lot of this comes out of the growing influence of Schneider's dynamic model of post-colonial Englishes, which you can see here. This is basically a developmental model about the development of post-colonial Englishes to more and more native-like status. Many recent researchers have placed Caribbean varieties, such as Jamaican, Trinidadian, Bahamian, Bayesian, and others within the endonormative phase, that is, where local forms are being developed within standard varieties and largely accepted within their societies. So it's the growing development of local forms in their standard varieties. What we are trying to do in our research then is to extend this analytical model to its methodological correlate. So we are interested then in how these endonormative varieties that are coming around now in the Caribbean, we are interested in how we might develop endonormative methodologies for them. Sorry? Okay, good. So we should have 2 caveats though before we proceed. An argument for endonormative methodologies is not necessarily an argument against research methods which might have been applied successfully and previously. So we are not saying, for instance, that exonormative methodologies which have some currency in our situations might not still be used, but we are of course more interested in the endonormative ones that are being developed now. And also, we are interested, sorry about that. We are interested in not just English varieties. So a lot of the preamble that I've just given has to do with English varieties because it comes out of the World English's paradigm. But we are further interested in extending that endonormative look to Creole varieties, which are very significant within the region, and also sign linguistics within the region. So a brief note on methodological endonormativity. We recognize that we may need particular endonormative stances in our methodologies because our linguistic situation might present unique features which are best treated by them. For instance, Doiber has pointed out in this quote that from a structural point of view, English in the Caribbean is somewhat unique. And so this only stands to reason that we may require more unique ways of viewing that variety or those varieties. One last thing on terminological issues before I wrap up my part. We are also interested in cultural sensitivity and cultural focused research. So a lot of the terminological issues that we have with some of the research that has been done on framing methodologies has to do with them being called culturally sensitive. A lot of this comes out of the American canon, and we find that this is problematic from a hierarchical standpoint. It establishes a kind of top-down driven research model where it is the researcher who has to be sensitive to the situations in which they may find themselves, rather than a more equitable parallel power structure in which respondents are given equal power within these relationships. It also establishes the researcher as expert, and this can be problematic in a variety of Caribbean contexts as well. So we prefer the culturally focused method of researcher as learner. Also, and lastly, very important in settings of clear-cut high and low prestige, you can have this kind of research, this cultural sensitivity, where you may have varieties that are high and varieties are low. But within the Caribbean, especially the modern Caribbean, the linguistic ecology has shifted norms of prestige, where Creole varieties now have all kinds of covert and growing overt prestige within their societies. So we need more culturally focused research that can grapple with the realities of the modern Caribbean in that way as well. So I'll leave it right there. These are some references. Thank you, and I'll hand over to Nisha.
Okay, so I'm going to springboard off of Ryan's comment that English in the Caribbean is quite unique for to start off my discussion and to give you some background into the work that I've been doing. So let me get this from the beginning. Right, so I'm going to be talking about language education policy through critical discourse analysis and narrative inquiry. As Ryan said, English in the Caribbean is quite unique, and the teaching of English was used in colonial times to prepare students to function as good colonials. And even though attitudes have shifted more favorably towards the Trinidad Creole and Tobago Creoles on these islands, these Creoles are still often sanctioned in education discourse as appropriate for speech and informal settings, but inappropriate for writing and formal settings. So when in the early 2000s, secondary school curricula were being developed in Trinidad and Tobago, I was a teacher at the public secondary school system, and I noticed the problematizing of Creole languages in the early drafts of those documents. So I undertook a longitudinal study between 2005 to 2012 to trace the development of language arts curricula from its conceptualization in 2000 to the release of the early drafts in 2003, and then to the revised versions in 2009. Of interest to me then was how the discourse narratives of curriculum developers legitimized or reconstructed the ideas of linguistic power and prestige within the Trinbagonian educational context. And I felt that critical discourse analysis and narrative inquiry proved to be two very useful methodological tools to help me unpack the personal, historical, social, and political context that would have been informing these curriculum developers. So critical discourse analysis helps the researcher to analyze discourse practices which encode ideologies, social structures, and relations of power. And I already mentioned that the Creole languages were problematized in the early drafts of the curriculum, even though the majority of the clients of the curriculum were Creole speakers, Trinbagonian or Trinidadian young people. So this problematizing from the offset and the philosophy caused the content and the activities and strategies, to perhaps not be the best for the Caribbean setting. So for example, whenever there were examples of impolite speech in the content, those examples were given in Creole. And when there were examples of polite structures, those examples were given in a standard English frame. If there were activities where students were to visit, let's say, places where indigenous heritage languages were still spoken, when they came back, they were not asked to talk about the languages or the interaction with those languages, but they were asked to do other kinds of activities, like, for example, talk about the trade practices of these people. So through critical discourse analysis, I was able to note that even though the curriculum promised an equity inclusive agenda, that did not extend to language use and to students' languages. In fact, the curriculum unwittingly provided a conduit for English language imperialism. Narrative inquiry was very useful for me too, to get phenomenological insight from people involved on the ground, so to speak. Because of course I was curious to know how they perceive the world through their stories and the experiences that they had in writing the curriculum, these curriculum documents. So 23 participants, through these stories, through the stories they told, had similar themes of feelings of inadequacy and incompetence, not just in curriculum development and writing, but also in linguistic awareness and in understanding how non-standard and standard varieties of English intersect in the Caribbean. They had these personal and uncontested ideologies that they themselves had of language found their way into the content of the curriculum. They also had other issues in terms of lack of time and political interference that made their experiences in writing these curriculum documents and enacting these curricula very unpleasant. So apart from seeing the problems or uncovering the problems of curriculum development, narrative inquiry and critical discourse analysis also helped me to see how these developers found ways to negotiate the power structures and reclaim their agency from what initially were mandates that they were given. So for me as a researcher, critical discourse analysis allowed me to broaden my understanding of the processes involved in legitimizing as well as contesting public education policy. And my most insightful findings came when I suspended my own beliefs about what I thought happened in the development of curriculum and allowed the participants and the documents and the study to guide the analysis. And by not assuming that I knew what actually took place, and by listening to participant stories, that eventually culminated in a reconstruction of how Creoles were represented in revised versions of those curriculum documents. Thank you.
All right, and before the other researchers come on, you all collectively just have 8 minutes between you. So just be mindful of that. Thank you. Samantha, you may want to unmute because we're not hearing you, miss.
So sorry. So I'm going to be talking about Caribbean language acquisition research, and this is going to be via 2 questions. The first question is, what principles should guide Caribbean language acquisition research? And this stems from 3 needs. The first need is the need for accurate description. because we do not have full descriptions of the languages spoken in most Caribbean contexts. And this leads us to rely on foreign tests, which can result in misdiagnosis when Creole features are identified or evaluated as incorrect English, which is not the case. We also have a need for accurate representation. We need to represent what actually exists and explore the full range of children's linguistic ability. And this requires us to acknowledge what biases we may have and minimize them. When we accomplish accurate description and accurate representation, we also have a need for accurate assessment. And this requires us to relay our findings to critical institutions that are responsible for evaluating children's language development. So that is seen as something we need to do if we want to enact change. Now, keeping these principles in mind, they're going to influence the methods that we use to collect data. So the second question is, what are the best methods to collect data from Caribbean children? The first thing we need to consider is diversity. If we want to capture a wide range of variation, we need to ensure we have diversity in things like sex, socioeconomic status. Otherwise, we might miss things that we would have picked up. So for instance, in my research, I would not have known that there were certain districts where children produce my one as possessive if I had only focused on one district. We also need to consider cross-sectional versus longitudinal designs. We have a history of longitudinal research in the Caribbean, but that limits our sample size. If we want to have fair and accurate assessment, then we need things that can be generalized to the population. We need larger sample sizes, and we need cross-sectional research and mixed designs. So we need to use both of them. The third thing is thinking about structured elicitation tasks as critical. Structured elicitation tasks allow us to focus our language research on specific tokens and specific contexts. So it is critical because we need to establish that description. We also need to use, we can consider using foreign instruments. We don't need to reject them or reinvent the wheel. There are ways as Caribbean people that we can take something foreign and transform it for local purposes. And there are many ways that we can use foreign instruments and expand them and modify them to suit our purposes. And this also allows us to evaluate those foreign instruments to test their accuracy for our population. Finally, we need to look at natural language. Usually people either have structured elicitation or natural language samples. We definitely want to do both. I will encourage you to do both because natural language samples allow us to see things we may miss otherwise. So if we conduct natural language sample collection first, then we can alter our structured elicitation tasks to really focus or get more depth about things that we may have overlooked or not considered. And the last thing I want to say is that we need to gather natural language naturally. So for instance, picture books are they're not useful for Trinidadian children. It doesn't allow us to see how they really tell stories because they're not familiar with picture books. So we need to use methods that are familiar and fair to our children. So I'm going to stop here in the interest of time and let Beth and Christiane go.
Okay, so whereas my colleagues would have spoken about endonormative approaches to linguistic research in the Caribbean with regards to spoken languages, now we turn to sign languages in the Caribbean. Now, sign languages are real languages. They have the same grammatical properties that spoken languages do, and they have the same expressive and communicative abilities as spoken languages. And you may not know, but there are many, many sign languages in the Caribbean that are very diverse and have emerged independently of each other and without influence from foreign sign languages. So Ben and I have had the privilege, along with some other deaf colleagues, to work with some of these signing communities in the Caribbean, some of which you can see here. You can see how diverse they are. But with these, in some of these signing communities, there has been some level of foreign intervention, especially in the field of deaf education. And the problem with foreign intervention that is exonormative approaches is that they're usually embedded in a time and space which are in a global north framing, especially, and that's not appropriate or sufficient for the situation here in the Caribbean. So one example of this is that there's often the importation of a sign language. So for example, American Sign Language or another global north sign language. And this can lead to the erasure and endangerment of the indigenous local sign languages that I mentioned before. And not only just the sign languages are endangered, but also some of the norms that come with these communities as well, such as the norm that signing is normal for hearing people. So, and they have positive attitudes towards sign languages that can be lost as well when sign languages are imported, and it can result in severe problems in formal education system. And we will give you an example from Region 10 in Guyana. And I'll give it over to Ben.
And before we do that, I want to say something about our approach to methodology. As researchers intervening in communities, some of the communities we've worked in are here where we all live in Trinidad and Tobago, but other communities are in places where we don't come from and where we don't live. And in the hope of not making the same mistakes that those interventions that Christiane mentioned before, one of the principles that guides our research has been not coming with an agenda, not coming with the point of view that we have something that this deficient community needs, which is how the exonormativity has expressed itself, I think, in deaf education, and not coming with a theoretical agenda. It's been observed that internationally, sign language research is often being guided by a theoretical agenda, which is not connected to the interests and needs of local communities. So what we have tried to do is to come and to lime and to listen and to spend time with people. And we have a picture on the slide there representing a typical type of research scenario for us as a deaf-blind man that we've been working with. Next slide. And what has come out of that is that different communities that we worked with, different deaf and signing communities that we worked with, identified different interests, different needs, and different problems. So just to tell you about one example, in an Amerindian community in Guyana that we have worked with, where there is a local indigenous sign language, one of the challenges that they identified there was the need for inclusion of deaf children in their local school. And there had been a previous intervention whereby people had introduced, as Christiane said, American Sign Language materials in the hope of providing access to local children. But we saw, and the community expressed, that this was not helpful because they already have their own indigenous language, their own indigenous cultural way of approaching deafness. And so what came out of that conversation between us and the community was that what we could do was help to document and produce resources using their own language in order to generate materials that could be used in education for the deaf children. And what you're seeing in the picture there is some of the materials that we produced. And the boy in the picture is seeing his own language represented there and using it as a gateway to learning written English. Back to Christiane. Christiane, your mic's off.
Yeah, I know, I was looking. Okay, I was muted. Yeah, okay, so.
Was that the end of the presentation?
No, we would like to end on with one more point we find very, very important. And our colleague here is making it for us. He couldn't be here, but he is saying that we need more deaf researchers. Right now, the field of sign language linguistics is populated with hearing researchers, but in addition to needing more local researchers from the Caribbean itself, we need deaf researchers. Why? Because we need to valorize their knowledge, and the best way of doing that is putting them in front of the process of doing so. So thank you so much for listening to our presentation, and this is just a very short summary of what we do, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, researchers. I was really, really interested in a lot of what you had to say, Christian, Ben, Ryan, Samantha, Nisha. And what's the name of your colleague, Christian? The one who came on at the end?
Ian Danilau.
Oh,
Ian.
Ian.
Okay, great, great. So there were some questions posed in the chat, and I know you all have been answering them as the discussion went along. I'm not seeing, okay, so there was a question, can sign language be creolized? And I think I had put a question there also, is there a specific handbook for the Caribbean, given all of our differences in tone and expression? So two questions in one. Can sign language be creolized, and is there a specific handbook?
Okay, I'll try the can sign language be creolized question. There are different definitions of creolization around, so it depends how you interpret the terms there, I think. One thing I would say is that sign languages in the Caribbean emerge out of Creole communities. So in that sense, they're Creole languages in the same way. If you take a cultural view of what Creole means. If you take a view that Creole has to do with language contact, language mixing, that kind of thing, again, yes, you can. That kind of thing happens with sign languages as well. So there are definitely many connections.
Okay, and there were questions when you were doing your research. Another question from Veronica. Did you notice any trends in young persons' oral expression when they do their chats and their texts? Were there common trends coming out in young people's oral expression in their chats and texts?
Well, that's not really a research focus of ours, but some of that has been investigated by Heinrichs and Christian Meyer as well. They've looked at Jamaicans' web use, use as identity construction. And yes, it is very interesting, and very interesting from an endonormative point of view as well, because here you have people who tend to be fairly educated, but using an interesting mixture of codes online to perform identity construction, basically. It's not that anybody is being necessarily sloppy or lazy, but when we use particular forms within web interaction, it's often for the purpose of identity construction. And as Caribbean people, that very much implicates us using Creole, and also, for those of us who speak English, of course, also English, and how we operate between the two of them.
Thank you. And there's another question coming out from the concerns of a lot of people who are writing into the chat. A lot of your research, how does it trickle down to the teacher in the classroom, in how they teach writing and how they interact with their students?
Nisha, do you want to start, and I can jump in?
Okay, sure. I thought Samantha was going to talk a bit about. Okay, so what I will say is one of the things that using narrative inquiry allowed me to do was to listen to people's stories, listen to people's experiences, and then in turn, after relationships were built, they would then listen to me and my ideas and our ideas about the usefulness of Creole in the classroom as a resource rather than a problem. And so we saw changes in the revised documents of 2009. I was asked to be a consultant on that, and there will be a revised document again later on. So I think that's one way to start. And the other way is through workshops that we do a lot on the ground at secondary schools, showing teachers how to manipulate the curriculum in ways to use students' languages as resources rather than as problems, see them as problems in the classroom.
Thank you. And a question of my own, when I was researching this topic, this word came across, transitional bilingualism, which treated Creole as a second language. And I know in the Caribbean, when we hear of a second language, we immediately think of Spanish or French. To what extent, I should ask, is Creole treated as a second language of worth in the Caribbean?
Well, this is a rather political question. Obviously, it has a lot of political consequences. It has a lot of political consequence for us, I think. But I can tell you from a structural and linguistic standpoint that the more emerging work being done on Caribbean language varieties shows, rather than English being a second language or Creole being a second language, that they're both far more closely related in the Caribbean than in a typical ESL situation, such as English in India, for instance, or English in Nigeria, where you would have it more as an ESL variety. More and more the research is suggesting that English is a second dialect for many of us within the Caribbean, rather than either Creole or English being second languages. So is it native? Is it something more? It's both. From a structural point of view, that seems to be what the evidence suggests. Now, what that means is that it also has to filter down from academia to people, to understanding that you don't speak a broken variety of one thing and then in more formal contexts, you speak the real thing. That's not really what's going on. You are making rather motivated choices about what you are saying, when you're saying it, and how you're saying it within particular contexts.
Thanks a lot, Ryan. And I want to thank all of our endonormative speakers in this section who looked to apply their Caribbean research to language. So this brings us to the end of the panel discussion. Ryan, you wanted to say something?
There's a question for Sam that I wanted to know, Samantha, if I wanted to know if she wanted to.
I saw the question, but I got a command from my seminar chair that we got to wrap up. So Camille, do we have time for that question? Yeah, I have to unmute Camille.
If Samantha could say it in half a minute, that would be good. Otherwise.
All right, so Samantha, the question was. Sure.
I saw the
Samantha, you talked about using foreign instruments and adapting them to local purposes. How might that conflict with Audre Lorde's quote, "The master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house"?
So I didn't get to read the whole title of my presentation, but it was hybridization as endonormative. So the idea is that the Caribbean is, yes, an amalgamation of a lot of cultures, but we transform those cultures to make them our own. So we can, I don't see any problem with using something that came from abroad for our local purposes. I think that's quite possible, and I don't think that it means that we are, slaves to the master.
Or even that English varieties might belong to someone else. I mean, they are ours as much as they belong to anyone else's.
And I can imagine this discussion could take us in so many various ways because of our perception of who the master is, even in this new context and framework. So I would call now Annabelle, Dr. Fernandez Santana, to give us her closing remarks and to wrap up the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. And I'm just astonished at the quality and the depth of the presentations that have been shared today. And I, in my brain and heart, connect so closely with so many of the opportunities and the challenges that have been shared. I recently completed my PhD using liming methodologies as my approach for research. So I can closely relate to a lot of the challenges, but also to a lot of the excitement that has been in the room today. I think the presentations that have been shared, they come from very diverse areas of knowledge and geography, but they have in common that refusal to take external standards for knowledge construction, and also the interest to recenter the ways of knowing, living, and doing of the communities where research takes place. And this movement and this process of recentering, what it does for me is that it dismantles the need to bridge the academic discourse on the one hand with who we are, because for affirming methodologies, who we are is the main thread that guides the way in which research is done. So that allows for a relationship between the researcher and the community where the research is taking place to be a relationship between subjects and not between a subject and the object of a research. And that creates an environment for knowledge construction where everyone involved is an agent in that process. And that extends to the people with diverse needs, as has been brilliantly exemplified in the panel about Indigenous Sign Languages coming and being recentered. So on behalf of the CRM Organizing Committee, I would like to extend our deepest appreciation to you all for joining us from all corners of the world and for filling this space with so much deep thinking. I have especially appreciated seeing so many connections between the proposals that have been shared. And for me, that means that we're moving together and that we're moving in the right direction.
So the challenge and the opportunity I would like to pose as a closing remark is that we need to bring our young researchers along with us. And the newest generation of Caribbean and African pathfinders needs to be able to access the strategies for research that are aligned with their lived experiences. And there is a lot we can learn from our colleagues that have been advancing the Kopapa Maori research methodologies, because it is all very well and good for us to be posting this into the world, but if we're not able to make it available and make it feasible for the younger generation of researchers, then our job is not done. So that is the challenge that I want to leave with us all, is that we need to make that available, and we need to bring it down to a level where students can see themselves using this as their main approach for research. I will leave you with that thought. And finally, I would like to invite someone in the room to close this space with Karakia. Karakia is the customary prayer for Maori people, the tangata whenua of this land. And it is a way of inviting all of the powers in the universe to join and bless the space, and also to close it and bring it up to the higher power.
Anna, before we get that Karakia, I just want to say in relation to 2A and the examination process, which is why we need to build our scholars so that we can take our examinations and thesis examinations out to you guys who have an understanding of where we're coming from and what we're talking about.
Thank you, Camille. Would someone like to close us with a prayer or karakia, or closing thoughts or reflection? Kia ora, Tui. Thank you very much, brother.
Thank you very much, everybody else. I will give a closing prayer in my language. Shall we pray? Baba tinokutenda nestara mambo Jesu nenguva yatava nayo sema researchers around the globe. Turopafadzei kudzwai namatwai nestara mambo Jesu tinonamata. Amen. Praise the Lord.
Kia ora, Tui. Thank you, everybody.
And don't forget, this will be put up
on the website to see the recorded session, and don't forget to follow us. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. Thank you, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Should we perhaps add that we'll email in terms of an evaluation instrument, and just ask persons to complete it when they get it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks again, Ty. Thanks again, Tui. Bye.